Tantor Audio presents The Lord-Protector's Daughter by L.E. Modesitt, Jr. Narrated by Kyle McCarley. The river boiled, and blood turned to ice, and electors fell to the sorcerer's device. Yet deep in the void they lurk in the dark, awaiting the time to return to their mark. Who will protect those who remain? Whose talent will our lives sustain? Lord-Protector, daughter, or son? In whose blood will talent so run? 1. In the late afternoon of Octi, Mykella dismounted at the base of the ramp leading to the north end of the great piers of Tempera. The top of the ramp ended some 20 yards short of the squarish one-story stone structure that held the portmaster and his clerks. Immediately to the north of the portmaster's building stood the shimmering green tower that dominated the northern end of the great piers of Tempera. Behind Mykella, her younger and taller sister Rachelana also dismounted, if reluctantly, as did 2 of the 4 southern guards, in their uniforms of spotless dark blue, assigned to guard them, for none of the 3 daughters of the Lord-Protector of Lanachrona went anywhere outside the palace without an escort. Mykella hurried up the ramp, and Rachelana followed, the 2 guards bringing up the rear. At the top of the ramp, Mykella slowed and glanced back at her sister. "Do you want to come in?"
"Why would I want to do that?"
Instead of snapping that Rachelana might learn something, Mykella forced a smile.
"I won't be long."
"Not more than a glass, I'd imagine. I'll wait out here."
Rachelana walked farther west, her flame-like mahogany hair barely kept in place by a dark maroon headband against the west wind coming off the water of the wide river Vedra. The wind was chill enough that the slightly acrid odor of the waters around the great piers was almost unnoticeable, and since the wind was directly from the west, it didn't pick up the far more odoriferous scents from the pens to the southwest, where the towing oxen were kept when they were not hauling barges upstream or riding them downstream to begin the process all over again. 2 of the guards waited with Rachelana as the other 2 followed Mykella. The great piers were composed of the long base, an expanse of unchanging gray eternastone that stretched nearly a vaunt from north to south along the east side of the river, and the more than 15 stubby river wharves, eternastone fingers some 30 yards in length, jutting out into the river. At the far south end of the great piers stood a second green tower, identical to the first, each soaring more than 60 yards into the silver-green sky. The towers were hollow shells, each with a single door at the base, but without stairs or any sign within that there had ever been any way to reach the top. Nor were there any windows or signs of any rooms in the tops of the towers, or in the others, identical, scattered across all of Chorus. More than half the piers had either sailing craft or barges moored to them. Carts and wagons were scattered across the short piers, some being loaded, but the majority being unloaded. Seemingly ignoring the chaos on the piers, Mykella walked briskly to the portmaster's door that faced the river and opened it. 2 guards followed her step for step as she entered. Inside, a squat, white-haired man immediately rose and hurried to the long counter that separated the waiting area from the 3 clerks who appeared to be checking invoices for the purpose of levying the proper tariffs. One had only begun that process when he had seen Mykella, she noted.
"Portmaster Chinekel,"
Mykella said pleasantly.
"Mistress Mykella, let me bring you the summary ledgers."
"Thank you."
At the left end of the counter, a grizzled barge master glanced toward Mykella and the pair of guards behind her, then looked quickly away and back at the clerk, who stood waiting for him to finish declaring his cargo so that the form could be completed and the proper tariff levied, after inspection. Chiankel set the ledger before Mykella. She began to study the entries for the week, of the sailing traders and the numbers of barges that had ported and departed, both those towed laboriously upstream and those headed downstream with the current and guided by long sweeps. Most of those headed downstream were departing lighter than they had arrived, since, as the capital of Lanachrona, Tempera was generally a destination port, although wines from the Vian Hills and glassware from Crost were sought throughout the entire west of Chorus, from frigid Northport to Southgate. The total number of barges and other vessels was only 3 less than the total for the previous week, and the total of tariffs levied was close to the same. Mykella nodded and straightened.
"Thank you, Portmaster. How do you think the trading and traffic have been?"
Chiankel furrowed his brow, then tilted his head.
"It'd be hard to say, mistress. Not all that different from last week. It seems about the same as it should be for this time of year."
He smiled ruefully.
"When you get to be my age, the years blur, but I'd know if things were greatly different."
He nodded.
"That I would."
"Are we getting much trade from the east?"
"Not any more than one would expect, now that we're into winter. No less, either, from what I've seen. A bit more iron from the iron valleys. Night silk, who can say? That comes over land and under guard."
Mykella nodded to that.
"Thank you."
"My pleasure, mistress."
Mykella turned. As she walked from the building, followed by the 2 southern guards, behind her Mykella heard the barge master.
"Is she? Not seen her before. Lord-Protector's eldest. Checks on tariffs since midsummer."
Had it been for less than 2 seasons? It seemed longer than that to Mykella. Once back out on the great piers, Mykella continued to where Rachelana was standing. Just short of her sister, she paused to watch as a trading vessel eased out into the current and spread its sails, struggling upriver against the current. Was the trader bound for Bourlin, or farther east, perhaps to Salon, the easternmost river port in Lanachrona before the Vedra became unnavigable?
What was it like, I wonder, when people could travel upstream without sails or oars?
She asked.
"Do you really believe those absurd tales about the electors? How could anyone?"
Rachelana sniffed.
"I mean, flying on creatures with wings as wide as sails, and on ships that had no sails or oars at all, and the river Vedra boiling over when it all came to an end in the great cataclysm. And Soras, little winged women who floated in mid-air yet destroyed giant electors. In hundreds of years, no one has ever found the remains of anything like that. Really, I could write a better story myself."
"Perhaps you should,"
Mykella said blandly, knowing patience to write anything of length was hardly one of her sister's strengths.
"Why bother? Anyone with any sense thinks they're just stories for children."
"Then who built the Eternistone highways, and why are the old buildings built so large?"
asked Mykella.
"We've both seen chairs in the storerooms that are too large for the largest man to sit in them, and the steps in the palace are all too high to be comfortable climbing them."
"It's all nonsense,"
rejoined Rachelana.
"They're just ceremonial chairs built for past Lords-Protector who wanted to seem larger, and the stairs are to make anyone who enters uncomfortable in the presence of the Lord-Protector."
Mykella refrained from pointing out that an overlarge throne or chair only made a large man seem smaller, and a man of average size seem insignificant. Rachelana wasn't about to listen to anything that reasonable.
"You're done now, aren't you?"
Rachelana snapped, rebuttoning the top flap of her dark maroon jacket.
"I'm freezing. It is winter, you know."
"Barely," replied Mykella. Octi was the 8th day of the week, the last full working day before the end days of Navdi and Dekti, and this particular Octi was the 2nd of the winter. Besides, Tempra never got as cold as the Iron Valleys did, the forbidding lands that stretched northward from the far side of the Vedra, reaching almost to the ice sands that bordered the Erlal Plateau.
"I still don't see why you need to come here every Octi."
"I'm checking with the portmaster to see how many traders ported this week compared to the week before. The tariff ledgers in the palace just show the totals collected. It's not the same."
"I don't see why you spend so much time checking on river traders and talking to people like the portmaster, or those barge masters."
Rachelana offered her most serious frown.
"You're the Lord Protector's daughter, not a clerk like Kiedrin."
"If father's brother can be finance minister, I can certainly supervise the accounting,"
Mykella replied. In any instance, doing that was far less boring than speculating about which son of which ruler in what adjoining land might decide to make an offer for her hand. Mykella preferred to avoid thinking about that eventuality at all.
"It's hardly supervising. Father's just letting you do it so that—"
Rachelana's voice trailed off.
"So that what?"
"So that you'll know more about accounts when you get consorted, I suppose."
Mykella knew very well that what Rachelana had said was not what she'd started to say, but let it pass.
"Can we go now that you're done with whatever it was?"
added Rachelana.
"You didn't have to come,"
Mykella pointed out.
"Or did you think that Baronet might want to escort us?"
"I thought it might be more interesting than helping Nealia or Aurelia plan the dinner menus for next week."
Rachelana's tone suggested that she would rather have planned menus, at least if her cousin Baronet didn't happen to take charge of their guard detail. That was highly unlikely, because Baronet was a captain in the Southern Guards in charge of a whole company, and captains didn't do escort duties, except on ceremonial occasions. Rather than say more, Mykella strode away from her sister toward the mounts, and the 2 guards who had remained at the foot of the piers with the mounts. She skipped to her left to avoid a porter guiding a loading barrow stacked with kegs of something, then hurried down the long Eternastone ramp, whose surface had remained smooth and hard against any kind of abuse for generations, possibly thousands of years, if the old tales that Rachelana dismissed were in fact correct. The 2 guards trailed the 2 sisters. Beyond the base of the ramp waited the remaining guards and the horses. Mykella mounted the gray gelding, hating the fact that she was so short that mounting was always an acrobatic exercise whenever she wasn't near a mounting block. But she refused to have anyone give her a leg up. At least with practice, she'd turned it into a graceful acrobatic maneuver. It helped that she usually wore trousers and boots, much to the dismay of her father. Although she was half a head taller than Mykella, Rachelana accepted the aid offered by one of the Southern Guards, even though she was wearing split riding skirts, maroon to match her riding jacket, and could have mounted unaided. Mykella eased the gelding around and flicked the reins to direct her mount along the stone-paved road that led eastward to the Lord-Protector's palace, hardly more than a vaunt east of the north end of the great piers.
"You always do that, you know,"
Rachelana said, drawing her mount alongside Mykella.
"Do what?"
replied Mykella.
"Walk away when you don't want to talk about something."
Rachelana leaned sideways in the saddle and lowered her voice.
"At least Baronet jokes about things, and he's good to look at."
"He is very good-looking."
Mykella offered a smile, one she didn't feel, even though she knew her sister would see through her facade.
He can be very humorous and charming. I'd hoped Jerixilt might have been able to escort us.
She knew that was unlikely, because their brother, younger than Mykella herself, but older than Rachelana, was still in training, although he was, officially, a junior officer in the Southern Guards.
He's escorting a visiting Seltyr from Southgate, Salia said.
Rachelana said, her voice still low.
He might be an envoy from one of the 12.
Mykella concealed a wince. There was only one reason a Seltyr from one of the 12 who jointly ruled the trading city-state of Southgate would be in Tempra, and that was to look for a bride for either a widowed Seltyr or his son. Not the only reason, Mykella corrected herself, but one of the few. From everything she had heard about Southgate, she had no desire to go there, not where women were virtual prisoners, and where even the winter was unbearably warm. She glanced to her right. On the south side of the road, for the half-vaunt east and west of the palace, were the gardens planted by her grandfather. Even though the trees that were not evergreens were bare, she still enjoyed looking at the stone walks and hedges and banked flower beds, and the bridges over the stone-walled small streams. For the moment, both riding and the view took her mind off her growing concerns. Mykella couldn't help but worry. Chiankel's ledgers showed a very normal flow of trade, both of barges and free-sailing traders, but the master finance ledgers showed a decline in tariff revenues. She had her suspicions, but at the moment, that was all that they were, and there was little enough that she could say, because her father only allowed her to monitor the finance accounts as a favor, until a suitable match for her was available.
"What are you going to wear to the ball?"
asked Rachelana.
The ball? That's weeks away. I hadn't even thought about it.
I suppose you haven't. You should have, especially if there's going to be an envoy there. You need to plan ahead if you want a dress made.
I have plenty of dresses.
More than she would really ever need if she had her way.
People have seen you in every one.
I'll think about it,
Mykella conceded. She was far more worried about the golds missing from the tariff accounts. 2. Navdi afternoon found Mykella more than slightly restless. Her brother and father had gone hunting in the Lord-Protector's preserve, the hilly woods that extended a good 5 vaunts to the northeast of the palace, a stretch between where the river turned back to the east and the Eternastone highway that stretched eastward as straight as a crossbow quarrel for hundreds of vaunts, until it finally climbed and split the Upper Spine Mountains, before descending and reaching Derica, the capital and home of the Landarch of Deforya, whose sons had been mentioned more than once as possible matches for Mykella and her sisters. Mykella did not even have the distraction of studying the account ledgers. While she had keys to most of the doors in the palace, since as the eldest daughter of a widowed Lord-Protector she functioned as consort at times, she was so closely watched that everyone always knew where she was. At the moment, she scarcely wanted everyone to know of her suspicions, and going into the finance study on an end day would certainly cause tongues to wag. In the end, by early afternoon, she left the family parlor, although it was officially a sitting room, and started down the main staircase. Not that there was any real option, except for the tiny circular service staircases in the 4 corners of the palace. She had not taken 3 steps past the pair of guards stationed at the top of the steps when Rachelana appeared, hurrying past the 2 to join Mykella.
"Where are you going?"
asked Rachelana.
Out to the gardens,
Mykella replied.
"Don't you think it will be too cold?"
There's no wind, and I'm tired of reading.
She paused.
Where's Salia?
She said she was going to spend time with Chatelaine Aurelia, Rachelana replied. She says she wants to learn more about how to supervise the kitchens.
Mykella had her doubts about the depth of Salia's interest, but didn't feel like saying so. While Salia might be the youngest of the Lord Protector's children, and the youngest daughter, despite her beauty, Salia was more interested in hunting and arms than in kitchens.
"Would you mind if I joined you?"
Rachelana asked, keeping pace as Mykella hurried down the steps.
Not at all.
Her sister's company would be welcome. At least, Mykella hoped so. Once they were on the main level of the palace, mostly comprising studies where various functionaries conducted the business of government during the week, Mykella turned to her right and followed the corridor west, and then north, to the northwest door, the one that led out to the private walled gardens off the northwest corner of the palace, far more secluded than the public gardens to the south of the palace. Besides, they didn't need escorts for their own gardens. Mykella opened the door, nodding to the guard stationed there, and stepped out and down the short set of stone stairs to the stone walkway. She preferred this section of the gardens, the farthest from the palace, where the outer walls had been sculpted to resemble a section of an ancient wall, or perhaps the builders had actually taken stones from such a wall and mortared them in place. The path leading there wound through boxwood hedges that had shed their leaves weeks earlier, but the remaining branches and twigs were still thick enough to block her vision of what lay on the other side of the hedges, which were just over 2 yards in height. With the walls to block any breeze and afternoon sunlight seeping through the hazy silver sky, Mykella was comfortable, even without a jacket. But then, she should have been, wearing as she was black night-silk trousers and tunic over the full-shouldered black night-silk camisole and the matching underdrawers, with polished black boots. Her father insisted on those undergarments whenever they were to leave the palace, and it was simpler to wear them all the time. It seemed almost a pity that few ever saw them, and most of those who did would not have recognized them for what they were, since they cost more than a season's earnings for a crafter. Soft and smooth as they were to the touch, they could stop any blade or even a bullet, although a bullet impact would leave a widely bruised area of flesh beneath. Not that many could afford hand-tooled rifles. More than a few had tried and failed to learn the herder's secrets, and now few tried, especially since the Iron Valleys were so cold and forbidding, and their militiamen were vicious fighters. What was the point of fighting and losing golds and men when the only thing of value was night silk that was cheaper to buy than to fight battles over? Mykella glanced up into the silvery-green winter sky where, a third of the way to the west from the zenith, she could see Selena, the larger moon. Although Selena was full, the light that shone so pearly white in the night sky was more like an off-white beige in the day. The green-tinged asterta hung just above the west wall of the garden, almost lost in the white glare of the afternoon winter sun.
"Do you think that an envoy from Southgate is coming?"
Rachelana asked, as if to break the silence.
When Salia asked him, Father didn't say anything about the envoy from Southgate,
Mykella replied carefully.
He just said that he hadn't seen anyone from the south in more than a season, and that their Seltirs visit ours occasionally for reasons of trade.
"That doesn't mean that he won't be seeing one," Rachelana pointed out.
"Even if one is coming, it might be about trade or borders."
"More tiresome talks about the land east of Zolt? I hope not. The land's worthless, Jerixilt says."
Mykella doubted that any land was totally worthless. While the hills and low-rolling plains of the southwest might not be all that fertile, they would provide a buffer in case the Seltirs of Southgate, supported by the Seltirs of the Isle of Drammer, decided to expand their foothold on Corus. Situated as it was in the midlands of Corus, Lanachrona was surrounded by other lands on all sides, and linked to them by the great, indestructible highways of the past. While key passes on the highways could be fortified and blocked, that was practicable only in the east, where the rugged heights and cliffs of the upper and lower Spine Mountains provided some geographic protection, and to a lesser degree along the river Vedra in the north. But the coast range to the west was so gentle that anyone could march an army through it and around any fortifications along the highways. Southgate was the greater challenge, although the Prince of Midcoast had finally unified the scattered kingdoms of the Middle Coast some 15 years ago. The Prince of North Coast was no real threat, not with the raids the North Coast towns suffered from the Squats and Rayleys, and the herders of the Iron Valleys just wanted to be left alone.
Mykella?
What?
You've got that look again.
What look?
Mykella asked innocently.
The one you get when you're listening to Father and you don't agree with what he's saying, and you don't really want to disagree.
You haven't said anything I disagree with,
Mykella said.
Then why did you have that look?
I was thinking.
Mykella took the left branch of the hedge maze path.
About what?
About us. About Lanachrona. About how all Chorus is split up and someone is always fighting.
Oh,
replied Rachelana, almost dismissively.
You're always thinking about that. You'd think that you were going to be Lord-Protector of Lanachrona instead of Jarrexilt. You'd be better to consider how you'll deal with whatever match Father can make for you, and how not to get rejected.
When Rachelana talked that way, Mykella almost wished she were a son rather than a daughter. But she was what she was, and wishing wouldn't change anything. Instead, she kept walking until she reached the northwest corner and the ancient wall.
It's colder out here,
Rachelana said as she came to a stop in the open quarter circle around the wall. The two of them stood slightly to the right of the small fountain, still flowing, as it did through most of the winter, except on the coldest of days, when it grew into an icy cone that concealed the statue of the fantastic creature, said to be a sandox, from the top of which issued the water. A greenish haze caught Mykella's eye, and she glanced toward the corner where the two sections of the ancient walls met. There, hovering in mid-air, was the figure of a winged woman, no larger than a small girl, but seemingly full-figured behind the gauzy green haze that concealed the precise details of her apparently nude body. For a moment, Mykella just gaped. Could the woman be a soarer?
Look, over in the corner,
she finally said. Rachelana turned, then frowned.
What? I don't see anything.
Mykella kept looking at the winged figure, and the faint greenish haze that surrounded her. How could she direct Rachelana to the soarer?
There, to the right of the horse with the broken tail.
Is that what you want me to see? That tail's been broken off since before we were born. All that green moss around it shows how long ago that happened.
As Mykella watched, the soarer dimmed, then drifted into the stone, and vanished, as if she had never been there at all.
Mykella!
A tone of exasperation colored Rachelana's single word.
There was a bright green bird there,
Mykella said, after a long pause.
I've never seen one like it.
Likely story. You're seeing things. Keep it up and you'll be as bad as Peataxel.
Who?
He's the guard who kept claiming he saw a purple glow in the lower chambers. No one else saw anything. Baronet said that they finally had to send him to duty down in Supat, fighting the nomad raiders.
Baronet would know.
Mykella tried to keep the sarcasm out of her voice.
He knows more than you think.
As Rachelana began to...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?